It wasn't all a case of jittery nerves. Along the eastern seaboard in 1942, American bombers attacked more than 50 enemy submarines. In the month of April alone, there were 6 confirmed sinkings of German U-boats within eyesight of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. It's also known now that at one time or another during the war, all 49 of Japan's submarines were sent on missions along the U.S. West Coast. Most of these missions were to gather intelligence. While so much attention was focused on a possible invasion by sea, it's ironic that the most massive enemy attack on American soil came out of the sky. It was one of the most mysterious and unique military bombing assaults in history.
It was a fantastic campaign in that it was the first intercontinental bombing mission that was ever, first of all, conceived and then carried out.
The top secret plot was known in Japan as Operation Fugo. It was the brainchild of a Japanese engineer named Teruhiko Takeda. His idea was that Japan didn't need airplanes to drop bombs on the United States. Instead, he built giant balloons that could carry bombs more than 6,000 miles from Japan to North America.
We think the Japanese planned to build around 15,000. Around 10,000 were actually constructed, and approximately 9,300 were launched. We're not sure exactly the numbers. We think about 10% of those made it to the northwest coast of North America.
A mechanism made up of connecting barometers, clocks, sand ballast bags, and fuses worked together to have the bombs fall over land after their journey across the Pacific Ocean.
What's remarkable about it really is that the Japanese knew a lot more about the jet stream and were able to use it in ways that we had no idea. First of all, we didn't know that the jet stream actually existed. And second of all, the Japanese not only knew that it existed, but they knew how far it went and how fast it went.
32-foot diameter balloons filled with hydrogen gas could rise 38,000 feet up into the jet stream, where currents could carry them from Japan to the United States in 65 to 70 hours. At such high altitudes, the balloons were almost impossible to detect before they released their weapons. The Japanese Fugo, or wind ship devices, carried 5 or 6 incendiary bombs and 1 high explosive bomb. The intent was to cause massive forest fires.
There was, I think, a kind of myth that America was highly vulnerable to this kind of attack, that because America had these vast forests, if these forests ignited, that they would create havoc, and that they would cause panic in the United States, and that they might somehow affect America's willingness to fight the war.
The balloon bombs landed as far north as the Yukon province of Canada and as far south as Mexico. They've been discovered in 26 American states, as far east as Michigan.
There are approximately 350 incident reports, which means pieces found in various locations all across North America.
The Fugo balloons had a self-destruct device on board, so the few intact mechanisms that survived were due to a malfunction.
This is the nose portion of the one of the 22-pound incendiary bombs that was the main charge of the Japanese bombing balloons. It was the last bomb to be dropped before the self-destruct mechanism went off.
American authorities were baffled when fragments of the balloon bomb devices began to be recovered around the country in 1944. It took months to figure out what they were. And then it became a military priority to keep it a secret.
The government felt it was important to keep the secret primarily to, first of all, avoid civil panic, And second of all, if the Japanese found out that their weapon was successful, they would send more.
The American news media cooperated and never reported incidents of balloon bomb sightings.
The country on the receiving end is not likely to put out propaganda that these things actually did damage, so Japanese were not told about this on the kind of radio broadcasts that went out of the United States dealing with the war, and it wasn't until after the war was over that Japanese actually became aware that some of these had landed and had done some destruction.
May 5th, 1945. A preacher and his wife had taken a group of children on a Sunday morning picnic in a park area near Bly, Oregon. While Reverend Archie Mitchell was parking the car, one of the children found an interesting-looking metallic object. When someone tried to move it, there was an explosion. The bodies of Mrs. Elise Mitchell and 5 children, ranging in age from 11 to 13, were found along with the fragments of what we now know was one of the Japanese balloon bombs, victims of a war that had seemed so far away, but had really come home. It's amazing that since hundreds of the Fugo balloons reached the United States, there weren't more casualties and more damage. But the Japanese had made one huge mistake in their attempt to set the U.S. afire.
When these bombs were being launched, especially in the later phases of the war, many of them in winter, during rainy season, when it was very unlikely that they would have any kind of actual effect in bringing about such fires.
The Japanese failure to really understand the vastness of the North American wilderness and also how damp the North American wilderness was and frozen during the winter.
Well, if they had launched those balloon bombs in the summertime, it might well, and it had been a dry summer on the West Coast, it might well have had very different consequences.
The Japanese balloon bomb campaign, which sent thousands of deadly devices flying over American soil, had no effect on the war. But more than 50 years later, they still pose a very real threat to Americans in the United States.
Although there were only 350 or so reported incidents, there are probably still hundreds of these bombs lying in the mountains undiscovered.
During World War II, technology made it possible to attack an enemy without ever having to set foot upon its soil. A missile launched from a submarine, a balloon bomb floating thousands of miles through the air, and finally, August 6th, 1945. A single bomb dropped over the city of Hiroshima announced to the world that the United States had redefined the term military invasion.
It is an awful responsibility which has come to us. We thank God that it has come to us instead of to our enemies. And we pray that He may guide us to use it in His ways and for His purposes.
The atomic age changed the face of warfare forever. The invading enemy could now be completely invisible. Any peace of mind that came with America's nuclear superiority soon evaporated as other nations developed the bomb.
The enemy, who apparently knows no mercy and who has signified his intention to conquer the world under the banner of communist imperialism. All over the nation, civilian defense crews are alerted to prevent the annihilation of areas vital to our industrial mobilization and our very life.
The Russian Bear was at any moment going to storm over down through Alaska and Canada and envelop us, and especially here on the West Coast, that was a tremendous fear.
Technological advancements in arms and travel have brought the enemy closer. An attack launched half a world away can now land within hours instead of days or weeks, as was once the case. And the enemy is no longer as easy to spot as a soldier in uniform. An attacking agent may even be in the form of a microscopic organism.
What's even more insidious about biologicals is that you will not know that you've been attacked. For example, anthrax, you're talking about numbers of deaths ranging from, let's say, an attack in New York City, from 50 to 100,000 in the low end to 1 million in the high end.
The battlefields have changed as well.
The lesson of the World Trade Center bombing is that a small group of conspirators with limited capacity, using relatively crude materials, can achieve an enormous effect.
A single terrorist can now cause more devastation than an entire army once could. The targets include crowded office buildings, passenger airliners, even schools and hospitals in any city.
If we ask the question, will terrorists bring in the suitcase-sized nuclear weapon, I got to say that it's feasible.
As the threat of invasion has increased, so have the efforts to combat them.
We've got some very good people in the counterterrorism business. I think our intelligence agencies in this regard are excellent. It's important, too, that we not let them win by adopting methods that sort of close down our society. I mean, they win if, in effect, we are forced to change our basic way of doing business. If we're forced to become a closed rather than an open society, to reduce the freedom that we enjoy in order to counter terrorism, then the terrorist has won.
Any nation is vulnerable to an outside invasion, but we learn that the human spirit can overcome even the most devastating attacks when we go in search of history.